Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Rachel Hines. She's a family physician, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, A Physician Mother Embraces the Power of And During the Pandemic. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we'll get into your article in a bit. But first off, tell me your story and your journey to where you are today.
Yeah, so my route was maybe a little bit more circuitous than some. I always wanted to be a physician ever since middle school, I think, and then ended up actually taking some time between undergrad and medical school to teach high school biology, which I also loved. That was in Eastern North Carolina. So that was also my first introduction to the state that I still live in. And then I decided that while I loved the classroom, felt like I could teach in medicine, but also really go to other levels as far as just like understanding the science behind what I was teaching my students and empower people about their health in other ways. So went to medical school, stayed at UNC for all my training, and then recently, a couple years ago, made a move out to Asheville, North Carolina to join a medical school classmate in practice out here in a direct primary care practice, which is a different model of primary care that's based on a membership instead of kind of traditional fee-for-service insurance billing.
And for those of my audience who are not familiar with a direct primary care practice, so can you tell me a little bit more about the practice itself and why you decided to go that route versus a traditional practice?
Yeah. Our practice is called Lantern Health, and really the name tries to conjure being kind of a beacon or like a new path forward in healthcare. My physician partner and I both came from traditional practices and were feeling really burdened with the volume of patients on our schedule and feeling like we couldn't make meaningful connections in such a short amount of time. And that time really only left us the ability to write a referral or write a prescription without kind of getting at the root cause of what was going on in people's lives. And so direct primary care, because it sort of just changes the whole payment model and really blows open the opportunities to engage with people in a variety of ways and with really flexible amounts of time, has just totally changed that and has been really rewarding. So we spend 30 to 60 minutes with every patient instead of 10 to 15, and they can text us or call us in much more kind of nimble ways, which of course, especially since COVID, has been particularly useful.
And how has the pandemic affected you and your practice?
The biggest change, because like I was saying, the virtual care was actually part and parcel of our practice well before the pandemic. So we felt really well equipped to pivot to all virtual care temporarily when things were pretty uncertain. What has been more dramatic for us in Asheville is that a lot of our patients come to us via their employer. So their employer pays the membership on behalf of them. And so many people got laid off, particularly in the service industry, which is really the heart and soul of Asheville. We have a really robust arts and restaurant and tourism industry. We live, in the North Carolina mountains. That was really challenging because in losing their employment, a lot of people also, at least temporarily, lost access to healthcare. So we've been trying to kind of navigate how to continue to support people during the time when their incomes and benefits are in flux.
All right, I want to go and talk about your Kevin MD article, A Physician Mother Embraces the Power of And During the Pandemic. Can you walk my audience through that article and explain why you decided to write it?
Yeah, sure. The reflection started coming to me, I think, as I was interacting with people in my personal life and then also my professional life and talking about just a simple question like, how are you? And it just felt like such a complicated answer all of a sudden. Like in one day, I would just be feeling so overwhelmed with anxiety about the state of the world. And then my personal reality actually felt really joyful at times. My kids were out of school. We were hiking and like spending more time together, and the weather was turning really beautiful here. That's like a magical time of year in the mountains. Things were blooming, and it just felt like this really stark contrast. And I just found myself needing, for my own sake, to sort of accept that ambivalence about reality and It made me think a lot about a strategy that I was introduced to in residency that I mentioned in the article called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, which we were trained a little bit in by a clinical psychologist as residents. Her name was Irene, and give her full credit for introducing that concept. But one of the kind of basic tools is using the word and instead of but, because it really, I think, acknowledges that most of us live in mixed emotions. Like, that's not something that we have to shy away from, or we have to like pick a side at all times. Like, I have to only be anxious today. Like, I can be anxious and joyful, or I can be excited and nervous. I think in this story I reference being like disappointed and rejuvenated by the whole COVID experience, and changing plans and having to just shift my expectations pretty dramatically, and being able to be okay with that and just sort of sit with it felt like an important thing in this really extraordinary time.
So it's almost like reframing the question to frame it into a more of a growth mindset. Can you explain how that subtle change has affected you both professionally and in your family life?
Professionally, ever since Irene introduced the concept, I think I've really leveraged it quite a bit in talking with people that I interact with, particularly patients who, for example, who are working on some kind of lifestyle change, whether it's, change in nutrition or reducing cigarettes or whatever it may be, because we're really all in any moment like doing the best we can. And there's always opportunities to do better, and really like giving specific examples of that and acknowledging both of those things. You are doing the best you can, and you can do better. But you can do better, because that just totally takes away all the valid efforts that are being put forth. That's been a really helpful tool. And I think in my personal life, I had never really thought about this until I had kids, and then also started watching Daniel Tiger. I don't know if you're familiar with that show, but there's a little jingle that they sing that says it's okay to have two feelings at the same time. And so I've been trying to really model that with my kids. So like, they're going to start new classes in August, and talking about, it might feel a little scary and exciting to have a new teacher or to get a new student in your class. Or certainly with the pandemic, like when they had to pretty dramatically rearrange things for the school for the kids' safety, the whole check-in process changed. We talked about, it feels weird, and like, look how hard everyone is working to keep people healthy. Like, those two things can coexist. Like, it's an adjustment, it's a real thing for everybody's benefit, and it really reveals something that's very caring about why we're having to make those changes. And that can be a good thing, but not like just dismissing, like, you shouldn't feel weird because it's just to help people. Because if you say but, then it just sort of feels like a different experience.
Sure. Now, in your article, you talk about your husband, who's an emergency physician, and you talk about raising two young kids. Now, there are a lot of physicians who are in similar positions. Is there anything that you've learned over the past few months during the pandemic that you could share with other physicians who have young kids who are married to other physicians?
I'm always quick to acknowledge that we've been really privileged here. The pandemic hit here much later. It's actually kind of escalating right now, but we're coming to it with a lot more understanding and information than people had, for example, in New York and Seattle, obviously back in March. So I think that the reality for especially physician couples then not knowing truly if it was going to really jeopardize their well-being and their family, that must have just felt so scary, because it felt scary to us even just watching that unfold, even though we knew that things were sort of, at least temporarily, not that bad here. What we had to really soul search around was, especially for Tyler, knowing that at some point he was going to be in pretty much daily contact with COVID patients, to what degree we were going to change our family and the way we operate out of kind of fear of him bringing it home. And ultimately, besides a couple of accommodations, like he doesn't touch any of us until he's come home, changed clothes, showered, we decided that for our family, it would be harder and worse to try to separate him than to, continue to live together and enjoy our family with the knowledge that at some point either of us could get sick. But I think that that's just a really personal decision. And I hope that more people, for better or worse, are figuring out ways to live with COVID. I think about it as like, in March, it was like a blaring TV in our faces that we couldn't ignore. And now it's sort of in my existence, like kind of a TV that's on in another room that I'm always aware of, but it's not necessarily at the forefront of my consciousness. And I have to find ways to make meaning of my day that aren't related to that. So I think that's translated into kind of how we live our lives and how we interact with our kids.
We're talking to Rachel Hines. She's a family physician in North Carolina, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, A Physician Mother Embraces the Power of And During the Pandemic. Rachel, my final question, what is your take-home message that you want to share with the Kevin MD audience?
Yeah, so I think that and is just a really powerful concept right now in general, with our country being so polarized around so many things. It's kind of like we're all living in this sense of dichotomy, is black and white, feeling like we have to be on one team or another around so many issues. And I think if we can do the work to acknowledge that we are all complex, we're all really Venn diagrams that overlap with each other in different ways, we're not just separate teams, that could really translate in powerful ways to a lot of other issues that we're facing. So yeah, for me, it's been an important concept to lean on when we're feeling like pulled to have to kind of commit to one way of being. And I think the reality is we're all ands and we're and many things, not even just two things at a time.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insight and your time, and thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. This is great.